This is Dan Jacobs. I'm the Regional Enforcement Coordinator for Northern Maine. And I'm going to give a presentation on Maine Forest Service Rule Chapter 27, Standards for Timber Harvesting and Timber Harvesting related activities within the unorganized and deorganized areas of the state. This is a fairly boiled down presentation. I tried to simplify things as much as possible because this rule is fairly complex, and I wanted this presentation to be relatively easy to follow and understand. And this is my little disclaimer. Like I said, this is just going to be an overview. If you'd like to see and read the complete rules, there's two really good sources, either the Maine Forest Service website on the rules and regulations page, or you can go to the Secretary of State website, or you could contact one of the district foresters if you're having trouble finding these online. Some of my slides will be a little bit a duplication of what Adam has shown, but I think that they're going to work in both cases. And you will see that there are some similarities between statewide standards and Chapter 27. So what I'm talking about with Chapter 27 is a rule that is applicable in the unorganized and deorganized areas of the state. That is the yellow on this map. Adam spoke about the towns that are indicated in blue on this map. So all we're concerned about right now is the yellow towns. And hopefully this is a logical progression for everybody. I broke the rule down into two main components to try to make it easier to understand. The first component that we'll talk about is the land classification by LUPC, the sub-districts. This is basically the zoning. And the zoning breaks down into three categories: the protection sub-districts, which are covered by Chapter 27. That's where we're going to focus today. The management sub-districts, which are also covered by Chapter 27. But in terms of forestry, there's no significant impact that Chapter 27 has on forestry activities in management sub-districts. And then the development sub-districts, these are not covered by Chapter 27, and these are enforced by LUPC. So our focus today is the protection sub-districts, and I've even whittled it down a little further, so we're going to focus on just a few specific protection sub-districts, the ones most commonly dealt with. And then aside from the zoning or the sub-districts, we have the land use standards, and these are the actual regulations on the forestry activities that occur within specific sub-districts. So there are three different sets of land use standards within Chapter 27. There's timber harvesting standards, land management road and water crossing standards, and gravel extraction standards. And our focus today is going to be timber harvesting standards and land management road and water crossing standards. So protection sub-districts and A and B, those two sets of standards, that's really where we're going today in that order. Like I said, the Chapter 27 rules and the zoning in the unorganized territory is a little bit complex, and it's important to have all the information needed to do the work that you want to do. The three essential resources, in my view, for staying in compliance in the unorganized territory are the land use guidance maps. Those are produced by LUPC. Those are basically the zoning maps, which do not look much like the maps that Adam showed you previously in the statewide standards towns. I will show you an example of a land use guidance map. Now, I caution folks that there's at least 3 versions of these maps exist online. So any one town, there could potentially be 3 versions. They call them, one is a parcel viewer, there's a large format map, and a tabloid map. And they're all almost identical. I have found some very minor discrepancies between these, and I'll talk more about that in a minute or later in the presentation, and I'll give you some guidance on how to deal with this. But the discrepancies are not great, but you may find them from time to time. The other important source of information is LUPC Rules, Chapter 10. That can be found on the LUPC website at maine.gov, subchapter 3. And these are the actual descriptions using words and text of the land use subdistricts. So in this subchapter, subchapter 3, the subdistricts are defined. How do you define them on the ground? That's found in this particular rule. And then Maine Forest Service Rules, Chapter 27. Those will help you determine the standards for timber harvesting and related activities within the specific subdistrict that you're working. So those would be the regulations on your forestry activities within a specific subdistrict. This is a list of the protection subdistricts. Not every town is going to have every subdistrict. What I've done here is I've put a star next to the 3 that we're going to cover today. And these happen to be the 3 protection subdistricts that I think are going to be encountered in forestry activities most frequently by foresters, landowners, and loggers. So you can see all the protection subdistricts begin with a P, and that's how they're labeled on a map. So for a great pond, the first star, that is going to be labeled as PGP on the land use guidance map. PSLs, we're going to talk about 2 varieties of PSLs. Those are shoreland protection subdistricts, streams and rivers. And then we're going to discuss P-WLS, wetlands. There's 3 varieties of wetlands that we'll discuss briefly. This is a sample section of an LUPC land use guidance map. The town is 4-3. This town is adjacent to Island Falls. I will forewarn you that this map is very simplistic in terms of LUPC map. We can see 3 zones shown on this map. Here's a large lake, and you see there's a PGP, a great pond, and this dark blue line or thick blue line is the protection subdistrict surrounding that water body. Here we have a significant river. I just got a little bit of feedback. I'm sorry. So here we have a significant river. This is a PSL1, and you can see that the blue lines on either side of this water body indicate that subdistrict, that zone. This area here is MGN, general management, and general management is not impacted to any great degree under Chapter 27. Now, you are still going to have to be aware that other regulations apply. Chapter 20, which Terry is going to speak about, and other regulations are pertinent in these areas. But Chapter 27 is going to have very little impact on your forestry activities in general management. So that's a very simplistic LUPC map. We do put these on our phones. We use an Avenza app, and we can see where we are on the map. when we're in the field. I will warn you that not all of these maps are geo-referenced. So I work a good part of my time in Aroostook County. I have found of the maps I've downloaded, probably more than 50% are geo-referenced, but I do encounter non-geo-referenced maps from time to time. So that's something to be aware of. This slide shows a page from the Forestry Rules of Maine. Mort and Adam both spoke about the Forestry Rule Book. And this is a helpful chart that's found on page 30. And it shows on the left-hand column the different sub-districts that you may be working in. The protection sub-districts that we're interested in are at the top, start with a P. And then at the top of the table are the different activities that you could be doing within the sub-district. And what this table does is gives you a starting point to determine what regulations or permits are applicable for the activity that you're doing in a particular sub-district. So if we were to take PSL 1s, and we haven't gotten there yet in much detail, but PSL 1s are large streams and rivers, and PSL 1 is right at the top here. Now, if you want to do harvesting within a PSL 1, the code is S27. And S27 is harvesting is allowed, but you need to follow the standards in Chapter 27. If we wanted to put in a stream crossing in this area, in the PSL 1, it's an M. And the M code is Maine Forest Service permit. If you do a permanent stream crossing, you will need to get a permit from Maine Forest Service. Now, if we drop down under roads and crossings to PSL 2, we see that a permanent crossing falls under S27. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. No specific special form for a permit is required to be submitted if you're doing a permanent stream crossing of a PSL2, which is a smaller stream. So in this case, it's S27 again. You have to meet the standards that are in Chapter 27, but you do not have to do a full permit application for a permanent crossing. So this is just a review of our focus areas today before we get right into it. Number one, we're going to talk about specific protection subdistricts, PGPs, which are Great Ponds, PSL 1s and 2s, these are rivers and streams, and PWL 1, 2, and 3, these are different varieties of wetlands. And the land use standards, we're going to talk and connect them to each of the protection subdistricts, are timber harvesting and land management roads and water crossings. And again, I'm not giving you a lot of detail. I'm providing just some very basic information. So the subdistricts that we're interested in, we'll start with PGPs and PSL 1s and how they are defined on the ground. And there are some similarities between the PGPs and the PSL 1s. PGPs, as I've mentioned already, these are natural lakes and ponds greater than 10 acres in size. The protection subdistrict extends 250 feet outward from the normal high water line. So I think as we go forward in this presentation, you'll see NHWL, and that just refers to normal high water line. So 250 feet out, perpendicular from the normal high water line, around the lake, that is your PGP. PSL 1s, these are rivers and large streams that drain more than 50 square miles, and the subdistrict is very similarly defined to a PGP. It extends 250 feet outward from the normal high water line of the river or the stream. And we will talk about normal high water line in some upcoming slides. So here you can see this is the west branch of the Penobscot River. That's obviously a PSL1 on the picture on the right-hand side, picture on the left-hand side, large lake in the unorganized territory. That's obviously greater than 10 acres and a great pond. PSL2s and stream determination. So part of this slide is very similar to one of Adam's slides, which is kind of nice that it's not all new information. PSL2s are streams that drain less than 50 square miles. These are not the big rivers or very significant streams, but they can be nice trout streams and well-defined streams with a lot of value, recreational, aesthetic, wildlife. I will warn you that not all PSL2s are mapped. What I have found with the mapping by LUPC is the very small streams, mostly the ones draining less than 300 acres, are not all mapped. However, if a stream meets the definition of a stream, if a water body meets the definition of a stream on the ground, it still needs to be protected according to the regulations as a stream. PSL2 protection subdistricts extend 75 feet from the normal high water line. So the smaller streams, it's only a 75-foot, what a lot of times foresters call buffer, 75-foot zone. So this is the part that Adam has already discussed. He's talked about the definition of a stream, and the definition of a stream is the same for Chapter 27 as it is for Chapter 21 or statewide standards. You have to have defined banks. There has to be a defined channel. There has to be an absence of terrestrial vegetation within the channel. You can't have birch trees growing up within the channel. That's maybe not going to be a stream. And the one that Adam said was very critical is this hydrologically connected. So things like gullies and rills, they're not hydrologically connected. Those are not streams. Road ditches are hopefully not streams. There are cases where a road ditch will meet the definition of a stream, but generally they should not. Road ditches should not meet the definition of a stream. So we're generally talking about naturally occurring water bodies that meet all of these 3 bullet points. If they don't meet one of these bullet points, there is a very good chance that they are not going to be considered a stream. So I'll talk briefly about the normal high water line. The normal high water line may or may not be located at the actual bank of the water body. And this may be new to some, but we've been talking about this for many years. And this has been a definition in place for a long time. So it should not be new to the forestry community. But for other folks, it may be a little bit newer. So if we have a stream and it's situated like the one in the left-hand box at the bottom of the slide, forest goes up to the banks of the stream. There's no associated non-forested wetland connected to the stream. The normal high water line is at the bank. That's the basic, very simplistic location of that normal high water line. So in this case here, if we needed to put a 75-foot buffer, or if there was a 75-foot wide protection subdistrict here, we would start that 75-foot zone from this point here and have it extend outward from the water body. Oftentimes we have streams with associated non-forested wetlands. And in that case, the upland edge of the wetland is the normal high water line. So you can see here a stream channel, but around that stream channel and connected is a non-forested wetland. This edge of the woods here at the edge of the wetland, that is where the normal high water line starts in this case. So from the wooded edge, the sub-district, if it was a 75-foot zone for a PSL2, would extend 75 feet out from that wooded edge. Okay, the last category of protection sub-district that I'm going to cover and describe today is P-WLS, or wetlands. And like I said, there's 3 varieties that we deal with in LUPC towns and Chapter 27 towns. PWL1s are non-forested wetlands. These are primarily herbaceous vegetation. PWL2s are non-forested wetland, and this is shrub areas. PWL3s are forested wetlands and dominated by trees that are greater than 20 feet in height. So you can see these 3 areas here. The pictures are not exactly in order, but the only person that seems to bother is Terry. So here is a forested wetland. You can see a forester standing in the forested wetland. The soils are hydric soils, but there is a predominance of trees greater than 20 feet in that area. So we consider that forested. This area here, you also see a forester standing on the bank of a stream. This is a non-forested wetland that meets the definition of a PWL1 because there's really not a lot of woody vegetation right near the bank of that stream. In this case, the forester is a bit harder to see because there's a lot of alders and woody vegetation in front of him. That area is not dominated by trees, but it is dominated by smaller woody vegetation. This meets the definition of a PWL2. So when you have a PWL1 or a PWL2 adjacent to a water body, that will impact the location of your normal high water line. That will push the normal high water line to the upland edge of the wetland. So one of the things that we've done over the past year, and this is now on our interpretations sheet on the Chapter 27 page of our website, we have developed an interpretation to help people determine if they have a forested or non-forested wetland that they're dealing with. And this is a set of criteria that allows foresters, loggers, and landowners to actually take some measurements and make a determination that is going to be consistent with a determination made by the Forest Service. So in this sense, it was our attempt to get everybody on the same page. We want folks that are doing forestry activities in the real world to understand how we are making determinations. And this is how we determine whether a wetland is forested. It has to be dominated by woody vegetation. It's at least 20 feet tall. Well, what does dominated mean? For our purposes, the woody vegetation present on the site must either contain 30 square feet of basal area of acceptable growing stock over 4.5 inches in diameter, or there has to be 300 trees per acre of acceptable growing stock of trees that are at least 20 feet tall. Now, this may seem a little bit complicated if you're not experienced with all of the forestry regulations and if you're not a forester, but I think it will become a little bit more clear when Terry does her presentation, because that is very close. It closely aligns to components of Chapter 20. If you meet these conditions, including the wind firmness and well-distributed component, you have a forested wetland. or a forested area. This acceptable growing stock piece, AGS, that's another thing that Terry is going to talk about. So I'm not going to spend any time on that because you're going to get that probably in about a half an hour from Terry. Okay, now I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on the timber harvesting standards. And the last piece I'll talk about will be the standards for roads and water crossings. This is a slide that I stole from Adam. So you're seeing this one twice today. That's a harvest that was well done. You see within a PGP or PSL1, you see a well-distributed stand of trees that's been retained. And this was in full compliance with Chapter 27. I think in Adam's case, it was in full compliance with Chapter 21. But in either case, this was well done and in compliance with the regulations. So under Chapter 27, I see something coming up in the chat. Maybe I'll save it for later so I don't lose my train of thought if you guys don't mind. For PGPs and PSL1s, remember these are 250-foot zones, either next to lakes or next to significant streams or rivers. Harvesting, you're allowed to remove 40% of the volume. You're allowed to remove 40% of the volume in any 10-year period for trees greater than 6 inches. There's some differences here between Chapter 21 and Chapter 27. No openings are allowed in the first 50 feet from the water body. Between 50 and 250 feet, no openings greater than 14,000 square feet are allowed, and openings greater than 10,000 square feet must be separated by 100 feet. Within 50 feet of the water body, there's no slash accumulation allowed. I will tell you from a practical standpoint, if I'm assessing that first 50 feet of a PGP or a PSL1 and I find a branch scattered here and there, I'm not going to raise a stink about that. But what we don't want to see is this accumulation of a significant volume of slash in that area. And then outside of the 50-foot zone, you have to keep your larger slash less than 4 feet from the ground. So if there is large tops in that area, large hardwood tops, the thing to do is to lop those down if possible. This is a cleared opening that exceeded 14,000 square feet. This was located in proximity to the Allagash waterway, but it was not within the waterway bounds. It was an opening that was a violation of Chapter 27. It was adjacent to a PGP, which is a great pond. You can see the little tiny forester down here. He's really a regular sized man, but he just looks small because the opening is so big. The pond is out here where my cursor is off to the right. And there was just a very narrow strip of trees, maybe 25 to 45 feet wide, left adjacent to the pond. This opening was probably approaching a half an acre in size. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how we handle things, this was self-reported by the landowner and forester. This was the first time that they have had a violation of this particular rule, and they generally do a good job. And they were very cooperative in our investigation of this. The forester from the landowner actually helped me make all of the measurements in the field. So in this case, because of all those circumstances, this ended up being either a letter of warning or a letter of violation, which does have an impact, but I don't believe that there was any financial penalty assessed for this. Now, things will be different if this happens again, but because they were so cooperative, self-reported, and it was first violation, we were able to take the least the least aggressive enforcement approach. Okay, for harvesting within PSL2s and P-WLs, again, PSL2s are the smaller streams and brooks. P-WLs are wetlands, and there are 3 varieties of those. For PSL2s that drain more than 300 acres, the rule is that sufficient vegetation must be retained to maintain adequate shade on the water body. That's essentially as far as that definition goes of what has to be retained. We usually just call this adequate shade is required, and that doesn't necessarily have to be 100-foot tall pine trees. So you can do harvesting in this zone next to these water bodies as long as you're leaving adequate shade and following all the other rules and regulations. Again, the PSL2 is a 75-foot zone, starting at the normal high water line. PWLs, there's no restrictions on harvesting within PWLs. But keep in mind, when a PWL 1 or 2 is adjacent to another water body, like a lake or a stream, it pushes the normal high water line out to the upland edge of the wetland. So it does affect where where a PGP or PSL can begin by pushing out the normal high water line. Now, I know Adam talked about this in quite a bit of detail. I think he had some excellent slides on this. When you are doing timber harvesting, now there's different systems that can be used to do timber harvesting. There's different equipment. There's different levels of impact. But in general, when you are doing timber harvesting, you are going to create some soil disturbance. Of course, season is a factor as well. When you are harvesting near a water body, such as a PSL1, a PGP, a PWL, or a PSL2, you need to leave an unscarified filter strip. So that means that adjacent to those water bodies, you need to have the duff layer intact. You cannot have soil disturbance adjacent to that water body. And the width of what we're calling a filter area next to these water bodies is determined based on slope. This slope table comes directly from the Chapter 27 rules. The minimum unscarified filter strip width is 25 feet. If you have greater slopes than 10%, as you can see here, the filter strip width has to be increased. So in this picture, you see that there is a slope, a stream at the bottom, and a gradual slope on the right-hand side. That's less than 10%. So that's a 25-foot unscarified filter strip. On this side, the left-hand side, it's steeper. That requires a 45-foot wide unscarified filter strip. So your skid trails on this steep side, where you're going to be creating ground disturbance, you want your skid trails to be outside of that 45-foot unscarified filter area. You can still do harvesting in here and cut some trees, but you want to leave very little impact to the ground, the leaf litter and the duff in that area. Okay, so another thing I'd like to speak about is timber harvesting in relation to temporary stream crossings with PSL1s and PSL2s. Like Adam said, there can be no damage to a stream channel when a crossing is done, a temporary crossing. And we define a temporary crossing as one being in place for less than 7 months. You can read what I've got here, but essentially you need to do your crossings either on frozen ground, and if not on frozen ground, then you should be using a structure. There is a little bit of wiggle room if you have a hard bottom and can cross with harvesting equipment and not do damage. But if you are crossing in a time of year when the ground is not frozen, you really should be using a structure. So here is a case where a crossing was done. This is in Aroostook County. This is a picture I took years ago. This is a stream right here. It was a stream channel, still flowing, but barely. And it was heavily impacted by the crossing. It was significantly damaged. The banks were broken, the channel was disrupted, and there was sedimentation. This is a violation right here. On the other side, we see that a temporary skidder bridge with wooden bridge mats was installed over a stream. In this case, they used, instead of bed logs, they used bridge mats to place their crossing structure on. So this particular crossing structure utilized 5 bridge mats, 2 for sills and then 3 for the deck for that bridge. But that is a properly done temporary stream crossing, no damage to the channel. If you're doing a crossing of a stream in Chapter 27 towns, it's also important that you take a look at your approaches and make sure that you are controlling water in the approaches to that stream crossing. And in a general sense, the structures that we typically use to manage water in our approaches in the woods to stream crossings are water bars. Water bars can be put in place prior to big rain events when the operation may need to be shut down, or at the time of closeout when the harvest is over. But envision that there was a stream crossing down here. We want the water on that skid trail to be directed into unscarified filter strip so it can spread out, slow down, and get soaked into the forest soils before ever getting to the water body down here. So within Chapter 27, these types of diversions are required to protect water resources. And these diversions have to be, as you can guess, outside of the filter area. Okay, the last piece of the puzzle is the land management roads and water crossings. So in this case, we're going to be talking about permanent crossings. We are not talking in this section about skid trails, and we're not really talking about winter haul roads. We're talking about permanent roads. There are many requirements in Chapter 27 for the construction and maintenance of roads within the protection subdistricts. In many cases, depending on the protection subdistrict you're working, a permit is required to construct a stream crossing or a land management road. And we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail in just a moment. Just like with skid trails, when you do a crossing of a water body, or when you have a road that's near a water body, you need to have an unscarified filter strip between the road and the water body. And you need to divert water outside of the filter strip. So I realize that this is not the greatest picture on the left-hand lower side here, but what we have is a road segment, a stream crossing here. You can see the stream down below. You can see that there's a wooded area between that stream and the road ditch turnout. And so that turnout is prior to the filter area for that water body. And that's what is required under Chapter 27. So our 2 main structures with roads that we use to divert water. Now there's multiple, but 2 main ones that we usually think about are these road ditch turnouts and also cross drainage culverts. The cross drainage culverts just being used to move water from one side of the road to the other side of the road. Whether it's a cross drainage culvert or it's a ditch turnout, these structures have to be located outside of the filter area. As you can remember, the minimum filter area for water bodies is 25 feet. So that applies to all of the water bodies or protection subdistricts we're talking about today: the Great Ponds, the streams and rivers, and the wetlands, P-WL1s and P-WL2s. This diagram gets used over and over again. This is a diagram that's in the PMP manual. It's served a lot of purposes over the years because it shows so much. What I want to talk about right now, though, is what we've already been talking about, is filter areas for a stream, which is the crosshatched area, and also the diversions that are used in this harvest site. So this is a harvest area. We have yard space where logs are brought roadside. We have skid trails that are in the woods, and we have a haul road here, a haul road segment. And this haul road is crossing a stream, and its crossing structure is a culvert. The crosshatched area is the filter area. So let's imagine that the slope is relatively gentle, so we only need a 25-foot wide filter strip on this stream. The black arrows are water flowing over the ground, and the squiggly arrows is subsurface flow of water. You can see in our road segment that these structures to control the flow of water, this is a broad-based dip right here, and this is a road ditch turnout. These are outside of that filter strip area. So this filter strip is unscarified forest floor, and that is used to, that's the last layer of protection on that stream. And so before the water even gets there, it's able to spread out, slow down, and soak into the soil and become subsurface flow. So these structures located outside of the filter area. This is, I can't remember if Adam had this in his presentation or not, but this is one of Adam's slides. And this shows a violation that was in his region of the state. You can see that there's a stream here, a bridge for a stream crossing, and you can see that the water is chocolatey brown. And so that is a violation. What happened here is there were terminating ditches. The ditches for the road went right into the water body and were pumping sediment into the water body. So in this case, a significant violation, significant impact on the resource. The ditches, the ditch water should have been turned out outside of the filter strip. Another thing that needs to be considered that is required under Chapter 27 is road stability near the protected resources, near the water bodies. Within 75 feet of a water body, the road itself has to be stable and not eroding into the resource. So this is one of Adam's pictures. Adam takes pictures of a lot of problems, so he's a good resource for me. You can see a culvert here, a stream right here. So this is a permanent stream crossing. It's actually a terminating ditch, which is a violation. But what I want to talk about is the stability of this road. The banks of this road need to be stabilized, and that means either with rock armor or vegetated so that they're stable. They also need to be built at a 2-to-1 slope. So here you see rock armor, seed with hay mulch, and a 2-to-1 slope. And they need to be stable within 75 feet of the water body. That's the key. Now that 2-to-1 slope, where does that come from? From a lot of different studies over the years, 2-to-1 slope, meaning 2 feet horizontal to 1 foot vertical, is where many of our road materials become stable at that particular slope. So they are much less erodible if you can get a 2-to-1. This is an instance, this is actually my pictures, and this shows an issue with sedimentation into a P-WL1, which is a non-forested wetland. And this was a case where road construction and maintenance was done. You see a cross drainage culvert here, and you can see that there's sediment moving down the the road ditch through the cross drainage pipe and heading towards the non-forested wetland. So they had multiple issues here, but among them was the stability of the ditch, the culvert, and the road itself. So the forester went in and did a lot of mulching and seeding, but it really wasn't enough to take care of the problem with the erosion and sedimentation. So this was like stage one here on the right-hand side of the corrective action. They ended up doing rock check dams and rock armor and a lot of other things to make this stable. All right, we will talk now briefly about some permanent stream crossings. Again, I think I've mentioned this before, that permanent stream crossings are those that are in place greater than 7 months of the year. When you are doing a crossing in a PSL1 subdistrict, these are the streams draining greater than 50 square miles, streams and rivers. You need to get a permit, and the permits applications are available on the Maine Forest Service website under rules and regulations and Chapter 27. When you're crossing a PSL2, there is no separate permit application or permit form required. So when you cross a small stream with a permanent structure in the organized towns, like what Adam was talking about, there is a permit by rule form that needs to be submitted. In the unorganized towns, the forest operations notification, as long as it's filled out appropriately, correctly, and indicates your stream crossing, that acts as the PBR. So in this case, if you notify using our notification system and you build your crossing to permanent crossing standards in Chapter 27, you don't have to fill out a separate form. Adam's already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into great detail because I see I'm starting to run out of time. But management roads and water crossings, bridges and culverts have to be installed to very specific standards in Chapter 27. One of the standards is that it has to meet certain size requirements. Under Chapter 27, crossings, whether it's an arch, a bridge, or a culvert, they have to be sized to at least 2.5 times the area of the cross-sectional area of the channel. So as Adam mentioned, there is a method to measure the stream channel cross-sectional area. And from there, you can use tables that are in both the forestry rule book in the appendix and the BMP manual to determine the opening size you need for your structure, which is here. And from there, there's also a table to determine which diameter culvert would meet your cross-sectional area. So if you have a stream that is 1 foot by 1 foot in size to be 2.5 times the cross-sectional area, you need an opening for your structure that's 2.5 square feet. And to get an opening that is 2.5 square feet with a culvert, you're going to have at least a 24-inch. And that's the basics of how that works. But there is a step-by-step guide on how to do stream sizing using the measurement technique in both the BMP manual that we have and the forestry rule book. So I've got a good picture and a bad picture here. We have 2 stream crossings. One was done appropriately and one is not up to standards. These are some of the standards that have to be followed for culvert installation. They have to be at or below the stream bed. So if you are embedding a culvert in a stream channel, you need to take into account that when you determine the size culvert that you need, because you're going to be taking out some of the cross-sectional opening if you embed the culvert. They have to be installed properly with soil compacted on the sides or road material compacted on the sides. There has to be at least 1 foot of road material over the culvert, and the head wall has to be stabilized at the inlet. So you need to have rock armor, vegetation, 2-to-1 slope, and so forth. So we typically recommend that the inlet and the outlet be armored and stabilized, but I believe in Chapter 27, only the inlet is specified. You can see in this case here, we either have an embedded culvert or an arch pipe, and it looks like it almost spans bank to bank. I'm not quite sure if it makes it all the way, but there's no issues with this blowing out, and it's close in size. Not something I'd really spend a lot of time looking at and assessing from a regulatory standpoint. You can see there's lots of rock armor here to stabilize the approaches and the abutments, or the approaches and the road banks. And you can also see that there's at least 1 foot of material over the top of that culvert. So this one gets a thumbs up. In contrast, this one here, which was from a job in Chapman, this was a new installation, and the stream was about 1 foot by 1 foot in size. I think I figured that the minimum culvert size that would be required if it was not embedded was going to be a 24-inch, and even that was pretty tight. So it was probably a little smaller stream than 1 foot by 1 foot channel. So this culvert's way too small. It had to end up being replaced. It's also what we call perched. Adam discussed this earlier, and you can see the waterfall coming out of the outlet side of that culvert. And the armoring was not really up to snuff. You can see a lot of gaps in the armor up here. Even with the snow cover, you can tell that there's probably not much rock armor there. So just about everything they can do, it could be done wrong, was done wrong with this installation. And like I said, the fix for that was take it out, put in the right size culvert, and put it in correctly. Bridges. So we've talked about stream crossings in general, we've talked about culverts, and now we'll talk just really briefly about bridges, but the standards are similar. You have to have a properly sized crossing structure. The bridge has to be sized appropriately. And typically, if you are spanning the channel, depending on the height of your bridge, if you're 1.2 bank full width, you're typically going to have a properly sized structure in terms of having the right cross-sectional area. But the sizing requirements are the same. Structure opening has to be 2.5 times the cross-sectional area of the stream. With a bridge, abutments usually outside the channel, and when they're outside of the banks of the channel, usually the structure is sized appropriately, like I mentioned previously, and the fill behind and around the abutments has to be stabilized. So you can see here next to the abutments, they have a lot of rock armor, and the approaches here to that stream crossing were at a 2-to-1 slope and were also stabilized. The only shortcoming I can see with this crossing is it looks like there's a little bit of exposed soil here next to the abutment. That would be very easy to stabilize with just some seed and mulch. Okay, so here's my final thoughts for Chapter 27, and I think I'm just about right on time with the presentation length. Chapter 27 is complex. It's especially complex because you're dealing with a couple of different moving parts. You've got the various sub-districts, and you need to determine what sub-district you're working in, especially if it's a protection sub-district or it's a development sub-district, because there's a lot of rules that you have to be aware of in those sub-districts for Chapter 27 and LUPC. Also be aware that the LUPC map that I showed you previously, the land use guidance map, was very simplistic with very few sub-districts on it. But sub-districts can overlap and the maps can be somewhat confusing. So here just shows a little snapshot of a river segment that is a PSL1 and a PRR. And so each, the PRR and the PSL1, have regulations that you have to be aware of. So be aware of those overlapping sub-districts. I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that there's 3 varieties of LUPC maps for every town on the LUPC website. There's Parcel Viewer, the tabloid map, and the large format map. They're usually aligned very well. Sometimes you may find a discrepancy. If you do find a discrepancy, I would use the official signed LUPC map that's on the website. And you can see, I think it's in the lower right-hand corner of one of the maps. I can't remember if it's tabloid or large format, but it's a signed official version of the map. That's the one that I would go by. Number 3, the Forestry Rules of Maine is a great starting point. It doesn't give you all of the information you need to be in compliance with Chapter 27 and the other regulations, but it's a great place to start, and keeping a copy in your pickup is a good idea. The other resource that you have to have if you're working in the unorganized territory is access to the Chapter 27 rule. Keep a hard copy in your truck. You don't always have cell phone reception to get it off the internet. Have it downloaded on your smart device, but keep a copy of the Chapter 27 rule handy if you're working in the unorganized territory. And if there's any questions that haven't been answered yet, I'll do my best to answer those.
Great, thanks, Dan.
I saw one pop up. I'm not in the chat, but I just saw forest soils.
Yep.
So as far as soils are concerned, the term hydric does appear in the rules. So you do have wetland soils is a component in determination of a P-WL, whether it's a P-WL 1, 2, or 3. But hydric soils does appear in the definition.